I hope that you've enjoyed the opportunity for a little break between lunch and this particular time. We have been blessed with wonderful sessions already last night, this morning. We are grateful to God for the opportunities that the Lord has given us this week, and we look forward to the afternoon session. So it'll be a little different than what we've had this morning, and we will look forward to addressing some of the cultural issues and moving into some more practical kind of things. And so I think these will be just a well-rounded opportunity for us to think about our shared work in Christ-centered education. We could not do what we do without sponsors and friends, and so we certainly want to recognize them, call your attention again to those sponsors in your program, and please interact with them out in the display area. But one of our new partners in the organization, as well as a new sponsor for this year, is Made to Flourish. We had the president, Tom Nelson, here as a speaker last year, and we were very happy about that. And now Made to Flourish has come along as an IACE partner, and Kevin Harlan is here to represent them. So take just a minute and listen to Kevin say a word about Made to Flourish.
Thank you, Dr. Dockery. It's great to be with you. As Made to Flourish representative, it's a joy to be able to partner with you in your mission. We were birthed out of a local church 8 years ago in Kansas City, specifically on the mission to assist churches and pastors in thinking through how to bring the gospel to every aspect of their congregation's lives, and in particular, the work that they do Monday through Saturday. We love and have a passion with you in developing and shaping the next generation of pastors, and one of our core strategies is we assist churches in building and sustaining a pastoral residency program. That residency program has 6 characteristics, including it's senior pastor focused, it's local church based, it includes faith and work integration in the way they think about pastoring. It is in partnership with the seminary. They are all post-degree after graduation. Think about medical residency as the model. It is a minimum of 2 years in length, and it is full-time paid with benefits on the church staff as a real pastor and doing real work for the 2 years. Really an opportunity, we believe, to shape the next generation of pastors with this combination of the knowledge that you're teaching and the practice and the work that a local church can do in apprenticeship model with a local pastor. We provide 3 things. We provide coaching and helping them set up structures and systems to sustain the program for a long period of time. We provide a collaborative network. We've assisted 54 churches so far in starting a residency across the country, variety of denominations. We're on a path to 170 in the next 5 years. The collaborative network and the mutual learning is significant. And third, we provide startup capital. We assist churches in sort of getting over the hump with access to grant resources to help them begin the program, to make this a sustainable program is something that they would do for a long period of time. We trade out sort of a short-term investment for a long-term strategy. The churches that we're working with are making an 8 to 10 year commitment to do this work of training and regularly bringing in pastors, graduates from your institutions into their churches to help them learn and start their pastoral journey. So why does this matter to you? We'd love to partner with you. There's really 2 ways you can help us with this. One is you have graduates, and we have a network of churches that are searching for those graduates. And we think this is a great first job, a great place for them to go learn what it's like to be a pastor, to begin this process of what their pastoral journey would look like in a healthy church context. We also know you have churches that you would like to, you would dream about having a program like this where you could send graduates, and we can help them build those programs, and we would love to meet those churches. We know it's difficult for you to vet and train and equip those churches and to assist them in building these sustainable programs. That's the work that we do. Introduce us to them, and we would love to have that conversation. There's a little brochure right as you walk out the door. You'll see our table there. There's an executive summary we have about the program. Also in your booklet, you'll notice that there is an ad that points to our Residency Accelerator page. Find out more, come and talk to us. Aaron and I are here, and we'd love to have more conversation with you. Thank you for your good work. It truly is a joy to partner with you in this work of forming pastors for the future.
Thanks so much, Kevin. At lunch, I had the privilege to introduce 10 new members and 3 guest institutions, and I left one of our new members out, and I want to make sure I recognize them this afternoon. We're so glad to have President and Mrs. Denton, Provost and Mrs. Matthews, and Jen Niska, Vice President Niska, here from Crown College in Minnesota. We are happy that they're part of our work now as new members. It's a wonderful Christian Missionary Alliance institution right outside of this Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and they are seated there in the middle row on this side. So join me, please, in thanking and welcoming Crown College to our work. We are excited for this afternoon's session. The end of last summer, I read a book called The Great Dechurching. I thought it was fantastic. I quoted it in the convocation address at the end of August here on the Southwestern campus, sent a note to Mike Graham and thanked him for their good work, and out of that developed a conversation, and we've gotten to know each other virtually. First time we've seen each other face to face, but I am so happy to have the 2 co-authors of this wonderful new book, which received a lot of accolades in the Book of the Year awards in the end of 2023. You'll pick out your favorite section of the book. I'm sure they're going to cover some things, but I asked them not only could they address this pressing issue, which is vital to our work anyway, about the Great Dechurching, why are they leaving, who's leaving, all of this kind of thing, but what are the implications of this for our work in Christian higher education? And so I've asked them to try to bring those kind of applications to bear upon today's conversation and this topic. Mike is involved with the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, and Jim is the pastor of the Grace Church in Orlando. They are the co-host of the podcast on Dechurching, and we appreciate their wonderful insights. You see them quoted everywhere these days, and so we are blessed to have them here with us and get to hear from them directly. So join me, please, in welcoming Jim and Mike to the IACE.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dockery. Let me first start by saying we are also the beneficiaries of Made to Flourish's work in the residency space, and it has been such a blessing and really just deepened the already phenomenal relationship we have locally with RTS Orlando. So I can't speak highly enough about Kevin and Made to Flourish. I also just want to say what a pleasure it is for us to be here today. We're thankful for what you're doing. We have some old friends in this room. We have some new friends in this room. And we're just so thankful for the ways that you are investing in the kingdom in a very unique way. So we did write this book called The Great Dechurching, but it didn't start out as a book. We actually had no plans or even thoughts that this would ever become a book. This started out really as 2 pastors. Mike was on staff at Orlando Grace Church, and it started from just cultural exegesis of the city that we lived in. And so we both grew up in Orlando. When I was growing up, I graduated high school in 1998, and growing up, Orlando had this feeling, if any of you are substantively connected to Orlando, you know this, it had this feeling of being sort of becoming of somewhat of a church mecca. I mean, on the church side, you had First Baptist Church with Jim Henry, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. First Presbyterian Church at that time was the 2nd largest mainline church in the nation. We had Dr. Joel Hunter in the non-denominational space, pioneering technology and worship. You even had Benny Hinn there down the street doing his thing. So whatever stream you were in, there was something exciting happening. And then institutionally, Reformed Theological Seminary came to Orlando. Campus Crusade came to Orlando. Ligonier, Wycliffe, Pioneers. We have just so many different organizations coming. Then I move to college, move around the world for about 15 years, come back in 2018, and Orlando now has the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle. And Mike and I really started talking about, well, okay, I trust the research, but why does Orlando feel so different culturally than New York City and Seattle? Because it does. And we started just doing our own anecdotal research, and we began to realize, well, a lot of the people that we're engaging with who don't go to church used to go to church. Many of them still carry with them biblical values. Many of them, as best we can tell, they're still Christians. They just don't go to church. We did find one study, a Barna study, that made the case that 42% of the Orlando metropolitan area used to go to church and now no longer does. So that's 2 million people living in Orlando who have made the decision, one way or another, for one reason or another, to stop going to church. Well, we want to learn. We want to learn more about what's going on. We knew this wasn't just an Orlando phenomenon. Many of you are experiencing this all over the country. And so we sought out to find more research, and it just wasn't there. I have 2 anecdotal experiences that pushed us to want to see more research. The first, when my wife was getting her master's in counseling at Reformed Theological Seminary, she was taking apologetics with Dr. Justin Holcomb. She had heard me speaking about dechurching and asked him if she could do a research paper on dechurching. And he said, I love the idea. There's nothing to research. We can't do a research paper if there's nothing to research. So that was anecdotal experience one that stuck with me. The second one was I had the opportunity to give a 10-minute talk on dechurching at a global a fundraising event for a global ministry. And it was just 10 minutes. It was just your run-of-the-mill talk. I opened for Max Lucado, which that was the most exciting part for me, that I got to open for Max Lucado. And I remember having this surreal experience after we had both talked. I gave my 10-minute talk, and he had his keynote speech, and it was outstanding. And afterwards, I realized I had a line of people who were coming to talk to me. And I look over and I see Max Lucado grabbing coffee by himself. And so I just felt this doesn't feel right. But then as I heard story after story after story, I realized my 10 minutes was talking about these people's children and their grandchildren and their nieces and their nephews. So this is not just data. These are real people. These are real people's pains, and these are real souls' eternity that we're talking about. So we wanted to get more research. Some of you are familiar with Ryan Burge. We commissioned Ryan Burge to do the most comprehensive, it is, the most comprehensive doesn't sound that great knowing there wasn't anything out there, but an extremely comprehensive, academically peer-reviewed quantitative national study. It's a mouthful. And we had to raise $100,000 for him to do this research alongside Dr. Paul Jupe, which is one of the reasons books like this don't get written, is because you don't make money off of this book. You have to invest far more than you're ever going to make. And we had this theory, this thesis, really, that we could be in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. And the study happened, and we, in fact, proved it. We are in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. The previous largest shift was the 25 years post-Civil War. Our shift in terms of percentage is 25% greater than that shift, only going the opposite direction. In terms of numbers, we are talking about 40 million adult Americans who used to go to church and now no longer do, which comprises a larger group than the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and all the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So that's the level of shift that we're talking about. And it's helpful to know the way that we defined a dechurched person was someone who used to go to church at least once a month, but now goes less than once per year. So it's worth noting, because if there's someone who comes to your church every other Christmas, let me rephrase that. If there's someone who comes to your church every Christmas, they're not a dechurched person in our study. So you could say the problem is larger than than the study shows, because we want to be conservative in the way that we do our research. Most of the dechurching has happened in the past 25 years. You can see on the next slide the dechurching. I know some of those numbers are hard to see, but really the big inflection point at the bottom is the 1990s, which we're going to lean into in just a little bit. But on the next slide, I've already said the problem is likely larger than the study shows, but I also want to communicate how much larger it could be. So in social science, there is a known, it's a pretty known and proven theory that the more economically developed a country is, the less religious it tends to be. Now, there are some outliers. Israel, you can see on there. The United States is the biggest outlier. We are what social scientists call stubbornly religious. And if regression to the mean is a thing, then you can see how much farther we can still fall. So it's just setting that in context. These 40 million people make up about 15% of the adult population of our country. It makes up 40 million of these people. Of the 40 million, 20 million come from Roman Catholic and mainline backgrounds. And let me say, by the way, as we get into more data, feel free to take notes if you want to just sit back and listen. We're going to have Mike Graham's email up at the end, and you can get a video version of this if you would like. I want you to know that. So 20 million come from Roman Catholic and mainline churches. 15 million come from evangelical spaces. And then 5 million would be from houses of worship we would consider to be non-Christian, from synagogues, mosques, Mormon church, Jehovah's Witness, things like that. So I want to go back to that spike that we saw in the 90s. Now, any good social scientist would tell you when there's a spike, it doesn't happen alone. There are things that happened along the way to make that spike, create the opportunity for that spike. We don't have time to get into 1776 all the way up until the 1990s. We would just say that's very true. There's a lot that contributed to leading up to the 90s. But in the 90s, 4 very important things happened. The first was the fall of the Soviet Union. So before the fall of the Soviet Union, in the Cold War, to be American was synonymous with being Christian. I'm not that old, but I can remember a time where somebody in a group setting said, I'm no longer a Christian. And the next question was, well, are you a communist? Because if you're not a Christian, that seems to a lot of people to be the only thing that the next option or the logical leap. It's not coincidence that in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, that's when we got In God We Trust on our money and Under God in our pledge, because to be American in that era meant to be against these godless atheists with whom we were in a struggle over good and evil, life and death. So when the Soviet Union fell, there was now freedom for certain people to be American and non-Christian. The second thing that we see is the rise of the internet. Now, admittedly, the internet by the end of the 1990s was only in about 20 to 25% of the homes, but it was in the schools, it was in the libraries. By 1994, internet cafes were opening up, which gave people the opportunity to dialogue, read about and even dialogue with people who had worldviews that they could not explore without getting significant social and familial discomfort. So then after the rise of the internet, we see the rise of the religious right. So there's a lot we could say on this as well, but there were people in the 1990s who said, if that's what Christianity is, then I'm out. Now, Mike Ryan Burge and I would say probably a lot of what's going on with the rise of the internet and the rise of the religious right is giving people excuses to embrace what they already knew to be true. It wasn't convincing them to make a shift, most likely. But then at the end of the decade, 9/11, just after the close of the decade, you had 9/11. So really, in terms of a historical perspective, overnight, the enemies of the United States of America went from being the godless atheists to these religious fundamentalists. And so you had people who said, well, that's what religion does. And if that's what religion does, I'm out. Now, admittedly, we can see that the lion's share of the dechurching in this era came from the secular left and largely from Roman Catholic and mainline churches. And so we have reason to believe that you're going to hear more from Mike in a minute, that they already had left the historical Christian faith, but these were the cultural things that allowed them to give voice to what they already felt. So then we started to look at a very high view of who is dechurching. Who are we looking at? And we realized it's very interesting because depending on your information diet, you would have a different answer to that. If your information diet comes more from the secular left, you're going to say, well, people are leaving churches because of hypocrisy in the churches and scandals and abuses. That's why people are leaving churches. They've been burned. If your information diet is more from the secular right, you would say, well, it's the sexual revolution, it's progressive secularism. Those are the reasons. It's the culture that's bringing people out of the church. And we would say both sides are right in a small way. The lion's share, while what the secular left and right are saying is true, that only comprises about 10 million of the 40 million who have left. The left and right are articulating a group that has left intentionally, but 30 million dechurched, as we say, casually. They didn't have a pain point. They didn't plan to leave church. They didn't leave intentionally. They would say things. Actually, the number one reason for dechurching in the United States is I moved. It's the number one reason. And then you hear attending became inconvenient, other priorities for our time and money. And so we begin to see people leaving in a way that doesn't fit the narratives that we're going to hear in media outlets both on the left and right. And again, not to minimize some real pain that people have felt in the church. We don't want to minimize that. We address that. But what we want to communicate is the dechurched person is not monolithic. The people are not monolithic. Mike's going to, again, get more into that. What we have learned is that we need to know what type of dechurched person we're engaging with. We need to understand, did they leave intentionally or unintentionally? We need to realize, as you're going to hear in just a second, many people who left are willing to come back today if only someone would invite them. Many people, if we just had them at our dinner table, they would come to church with us. And then there are some that it is just the Holy Spirit's the one who's going to have to work, but we will keep them in our lives and befriend them as long as we possibly can. So there are different types of people. For our study, we had over 7,000 participants with over 600 data points. And as we drilled down, we did the first study, then 2 more successive studies, and the third one was to really drill down on evangelicalism, because this is our space. And honestly, at the end of the day, we were doing this for Orlando Grace Church. This was an Orlando-based project, and we are in the evangelical space, so we wanted to understand it and learn it better. And so I'm going to hand it over to Mike to really drill down on what we're seeing in the evangelical space along with the mainline and Roman Catholic space.
So one of the things that we did in the study we didn't want to introduce bias, right? And so to not introduce bias, well, when you have a big data set, when you got 7,000 people, you got 600 data points per person, well, how do you begin to make any sense, any stories and all that? Well, thankfully we had Dr. Ryan Burge, and what he did is he used a machine learning algorithm to sort all of those different people with all those different answer choices into very common clusters. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, it's just a fancy way to say that people had very common answer choices in terms of what they believed about Nicene Creed-level Christianity. They had common answer choices about when they left. They had some common demographics between them. They had common willingness in terms of their relative willingness to return to an evangelical church, and then they had common reasons for why they would be willing to return to an evangelical church. So basically, you put all that in this machine learning algorithm, and out comes these clusters of people who have very common answer choices. And so, as Jim mentioned already, it's very important that we understand that dechurching is not monolithic. And so, what somebody believes, when they left, why they left, their willingness to return, and under what conditions, well, these things vary very, quite widely. Now, we go into a lot more granularity than what you're going to see here in the book. So also, just good news, I got 15 copies of those, and so after this, I'm here to give those away to the first 15 people who promise that you'll read them. So there's that. So but just bear with me. We're going to go high altitude on this, but we go into a lot more detail in the book itself. So, 6 profiles. 2 of them are mainline and Roman Catholic. Look, the mainline and Roman Catholic profiles, they look pretty similar. Okay, these are folks who left largely in their mid to early 50s. The view of the Bible was much lower than the evangelicals that we're going to look at. And the main difference between these folks largely left also in the early to mid 1990s. The dechurching that was there was a little bit more coded a little bit more politically left, certainly than their evangelical counterparts. And the main differences between mainline and Roman Catholic dechurching was there was more moving played a more significant role for those in the mainline, and clergy scandal and clergy abuse, very understandably so, spotlight and such, played a bigger role among Roman Catholics. All right, with those things being said, I think almost every institution here is more in the evangelical space. So this is where we're going to dive in and really hone in on 4 different profiles of dechurched evangelicals. So at the high altitude, you can see the names of each here. Now, cultural Christians is the first group we're going to look at. In total, we're looking at 15 million people, and the cultural Christians are about 8 million of them. The second group will be mainstream evangelicals. And the second, third, and fourth groups are about 2 to 2.5 million people each, roughly co-equal in size. Third group, ex-evangelicals. Fourth group, BIPOC, that's just a technical term for Black, Indigenous, persons of color. That means all the people in that group are not white. Now, one thing that's important to note is that when Ryan did the machine learning algorithm, we did not let that algorithm see race or ethnicity. So when the algorithm was sorting people into different groups, it did not have the ability to sort on those factors. What's interesting is that even though it wasn't able to sort on those factors do seem to cast a fairly long shadow in the data that even when it can't be seen, it's still largely there. So like the cultural Christians are 98% white, mainstream evangelicals 91% white, ex-evangelicals 82% white, and then obviously the BIPOC group 0% white. Okay, so all those things being said, let's dive into the cultural Christians. 8 million people, largest of all the groups. So they were a little bit more male than female at 58%. Average age, middle age, 40. They dechurched a little bit over a decade ago. Very high rates of marriage. When I want you to think about cultural Christians, this is somebody that's doing well for themselves by the, kind of the standards of the American dream. And what got them out of the habit of going to church is going to be things more like just the lifestyle of the American dream, maybe as golfing or kids travel baseball, or they moved, or a lot of the casual type reasons that Jim enumerated here in the beginning. And so the other thing about cultural Christians that's interesting is that they have a very low view of Jesus. Only 1% of this group say that Jesus is the Son of God, okay? Now, when you see the orthodoxy score here, this is stuff like the divinity of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, the hypostatic union, the sinlessness of Jesus, penal substitutionary atonement, resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and the reliability of the Bible. So the cultural Christian group, they had a very low view of the Bible, very low view of Jesus. This group of people does not look like they were ever regenerate, okay? And so, but what's interesting is, and what we'll see in some of the other groups actually do look like they look regenerate. And so when you're thinking about the dechurched, it makes a huge difference of which kind of profile someone is more similar to in terms of whether somebody looks to be in the faith or very much out of the faith and has very unclear categories in terms of being theologically defined. Now, what's interesting is that this group trends center-left politically, but this is not a group that has a high degree of sensitivity on things like racial justice. And so America seems to be working well for this group. Here are some of the reasons why they left. Attendance was inconvenient. Their friends weren't attending. They moved. There's a little bit of pain in here in terms of suffering, changing their view of God. There's some other stuff that codes a little bit left politically in terms of gender identity, scandal in the broader culture, too much restrictions on sexual freedom. Now, what's interesting is that this group, almost half of them, are willing to return to an evangelical church today. Imagine not thinking that Jesus is the Son of God, and 4 of these 8 million people are willing to return to an evangelical church. That blows my mind that somebody would, land that way. But again, there is so much, in the middle of, 1 in 6 adult Americans leaving church in the last 25, 30 years, I mean, that's bad news, okay? But there's a lot of good news in the middle of this. And like Jim said before, it's like, well, I can't do anything, even if all of us were committed to racism, misogyny, clergy abuse, clergy scandal, political syncretism, or battling secular progressivism, or battling, the sexual revolution, like, these are things that are so large and so complex, even with all of the weight of all of the institutions that are here, we would make maybe minimal dent in all of those things. And so moving into this conversation that we had, on dechurching, that was like a conversation that had gotten stalled out. And it had gotten stalled out because, well, what in the world are we supposed to do about these huge cultural forces? We're just individual people. We're just connected to these institutions. But what we're telling you is that 30 of the 40 million people who left, they left for super boring reasons. And that's good news for us, because most of the evangelicals, most of the people who left evangelical churches are willing to return to them today. Even people that look like this group who look totally pagan. Okay, so in the middle of all the bad news, there is tremendous hope. And so I want you to hear that when we're looking at this. And I want you to listen to what this group has to say in terms of why they might return. Number 1, new friends. Number 2, lonely and want to make new friends. 3 is kind of like an outlier of the supernatural phenomena. I don't know what they're going for there. 4, begin to miss church. 5, friend invites me. 6, spouse wants to go. 7, move and want to make new friends. 8, a good community. What do you see in common here? It's relationships, and they're looking for a good church. Folks, this is not rocket science, okay? And you're going to see that there's a lot of not rocket science as we look at some of these things. So they need, these folks need sincere community. Even though that they're doing well from the American dream standpoint, their mental health was not in a good situation. They need sound doctrine, spiritual formation. It's clear that they don't understand the basics of the faith. And we've got to engage this group better in the 18 to 39 age range. All right, number 2, mainstream evangelicals. This group, unlike the last one, this one's more female than male. Now, same age, average age 40, but these folks dechurched around the time of early COVID. Little less divorce rate, about average income and average education. But look at this, 98% Jesus is the Son of God. Well, gosh, there's a huge difference between somebody who's a cultural Christian and who's a mainstream evangelical. How you would engage with one is very different than how you would engage with another. In addition to this, their orthodoxy score was higher than people who were evangelical and still went to church, just by a little bit. And they had a higher view of the Word of God than people who still go to church. They also had a higher view of evangelicals, people who are evangelical and go to an evangelical church. Very interesting group. I know some of these people. I sat on the plane on the way here next to a guy named Kerry. And Kerry is a rancher in East Texas, in Tyler. And I was just telling him a little bit about, he saw me and Jim going over our PowerPoints and, making little edits and stuff. And he's like, man, you guys are busy. What are you doing? And I told him a little bit about the book, gave him the categories. He's like, oh yeah, I'm one of those 30 million people, the casually dechurched. I think I'm that mainstream, evangelical, person. I believe all, I believe all those things. So, I mean, these people are in your lives. There's 2.5 million of them, okay? So they code center-right politically. They are more racially sensitive, ironically, than the first group that was center-left, the cultural Christians. Why did they leave? Number 1, they moved. Imagine that. 2, attendance was inconvenient. This group, COVID-19, played the most significant role of any of the groups that we're going to look at. And there were things like family change, divorce, remarriage, a new child. little bits of pain here and there, but primarily these folks left for very casual, very boring reasons. And so what did they say to us about why they would be willing to return? New friends. God tells them to go back in a significant way. They find a church they like, begin to miss church, feel the distance from God, good pastor, lonely and want to make new friends, and they find a church that take doctrine and ethics seriously. All right. If you can think quickly and categorize these things, there's three things that these group of people are looking for. They're looking for to reconnect with God, they're looking for healthy relationships, and they're looking for a healthy local church, okay? Very simple. These are all things that we should all be for, and all of our institutions are designed to want to create. We want to make disciples, and we want people we want those disciples to go and form healthy local churches. So what does this group need? All this group needs from us here, and this is of all the profiles that we're going to look at, this is the easiest, most low-hanging fruit. These folks need a nudge from you, okay? They need a personal invitation from you, maybe even a water cooler moment, a text. Hey, I'm leading this class or whatever at church. Would you come in, join me, in that? Or hey, we're going through this sermon series. I love my church so much. Would you be willing to come with me, to church? We can go eat at your favorite, barbecue place after. I'd love to buy you lunch. That's all these folks need. You take, and yes, 100% of this group of people said that they were willing to return to an evangelical church today. 100%. Unbelievable. All right. They're also looking for a church that's going to take doctrine and ethics seriously. I think it's good for us to challenge these folks. There's clear pain for them. They're feeling some distance from God. It's okay to just kind of, needle on that just a little bit and gently. And then we got to engage like the previous one, better in the 18 to 39-year-old age range. Third, ex-evangelicals, very interesting group. 0%, and this is why we labeled them ex-evangelical. 0% are willing to return to an evangelical church. Now, the first two groups look a lot more casual. This group looks like casualties, okay? Tremendous pain. Very female, middle-aged, 53. They left a little bit after 9/11 on average. America is not working well for them. Tremendous pain, below average income, below average education. But what's interesting is 97%, Jesus is the Son of God. Relatively high orthodoxy score, relatively high view of the Bible. Now, 79% of these people are still willing to go to a different type of Christian church. So what's interesting is there's a lot of spiritual interest and a lot of vestigial Christianity still in the mix here, but there's just real pain. And so this group, they were 58% independent. America's not working for them. They have very low view of across the board of all of our institutions. This group's allergic to racism, they're allergic to misogyny, and they're allergic to political partisanship. All right, why'd they leave? Number one, didn't fit in the congregation, moved, attendance was inconvenient, didn't experience love from the congregation, disagree with the politics of the congregation, disagree with the politics of the clergy, negative experiences that they had, and no longer believe the same things that the congregation did. But for the 79% who were willing to go to a different type of Christian church, here's the things that they said about why they'd be willing to return to a non-evangelical church. One, God tells them to go back in a significant way. You can see the Holy Spirit still seems to be in there and moving in many of these folks. Two, they find a church that they like, a good pastor, 21% never going back. Feeling distance from God, they find a church that cares about justice and compassion for vulnerable people. They find a good community and they begin to miss church. These folks have church hurt, church pain. Maybe that was on the individual basis. Maybe it was on the institutional basis. Maybe it was a little bit of both of those things. But what does this group need? They need a nonpartisan church community. They need a church that's going to take doctrine and ethics seriously. This group's mental health was an absolute disaster. Most of these people are battling suicidal thoughts on a daily or weekly basis, and they need an empathetic church community and they need empathetic clergy. Finally, our fourth group of dechurched evangelicals, this is the BIPOC group. Riveting group. 68% male, 76% black. This means over half of this group are African American men, okay? So we're talking 1.25 million African American men, and this group had the highest income and highest education of any of the groups. We're talking big, serious, six-figure incomes, and they had the highest work rate too. Even though their average age, look at this, 51 average age, 92% working full-time. Unbelievable, only 1% retired. So this is a riveting group. They left right before the turn of the millennium, on average. They're doing a little bit better than the cultural Christians. Bear in mind, they've been out of the habit of going to church almost 20 years longer than the cultural Christians. And look, if you looked at our data set, the longer you've been out of church, the more your orthodoxy scores just continue to deteriorate over time. That only makes sense. This group was only center left. They're less left than what you might expect given the various stories around people who aren't white. They were not very racially sensitive. Now, granted, this is probably not a very representative sample of just BIPOC people across the country, but very interesting group of people. Why did they leave? They moved. Faith wasn't working. Other priorities for time and money, suffering, doubting the existence of God, scandal involving clergy in their congregation. Didn't see the congregation doing enough good in their community. Messages not relevant to their life. Now, what's interesting, 2/3 of this group willing to return to an evangelical church today. Can you imagine being almost 30 years removed from going from any habit and just having 2/3 of people just being willing to return to this thing? I mean, that's mind-blowing to me that somebody would be out of the habit of doing something for 30 years and just up and willing to do that. And look at the reasons why. New friends, move and want to make new friends, lonely and want to make new friends, child wants to go, friend invites me, good community, spouse wants to go, feel the distance from God. All right, what are 7 of the 8 things? It's relationships, okay? People need community, okay? What does this group need? They need cultural and emotional intelligence. They need deep friendship and community. They need sound doctrine and spiritual formation to shore up, just some of those, let's get Jesus right, let's get the Bible right, let's get the gospel right. This group left a little earlier than all the other groups. The 13 to 30-year-old age range is more critical here than the others. I'm going to skip over the main line. I kind of already covered that. And again, if anybody wants this actual presentation, my email is going to be on the last slide, and you can, I'll send you the exact slide deck that's here. I'm going to hand this over to Jim in terms of, what is some of the upshot of some of these things.
So we want to identify some myths, some insights, and practical applications for here. Each of these things could in themselves be their own talk. So we're hopefully just creating categories. We would be happy for you to email us if you have any questions or dive deeper, and there are some places that we do that. But the first myth is that people leave because of negative experiences with church. I feel like we have addressed that already. The second one is that young people leave because of secular university. This is interesting. Our data solidly supports what Ryan Burge has gone on to do more of, that higher secular education is not the factor that we think in dechurching. Only 3% of evangelicals with master's degrees in our study had dechurched. Now, someone might ask, Jim, why in the world would you say that to a bunch of the highest level Christian institution, higher education leaders there are? I have lots of thoughts as to why this is. Burge, Michael do too, but my main argument would be, I think there are actually opportunities to partner with higher secular education for the sake of the Christians in our midst and theirs. And Dr. Duncan and I were talking about this. There's a lot to flesh out there, but higher secular education is not having the impact on dechurching that we might have thought it was. Myth number 3, people leave the church because they left the faith. So we've articulated this already. A lot of the people who have left seem to still be regenerate. We can flesh out stories even outside of, kind of like the man on the plane, when we're able to see somebody, understand, oh, you're a mainstream D-church evangelical, would you come to church with me? Our batting average is 1,000 right now. They've always come to church, and most of them have stuck. We have different ways of assessing where they are. I have 4 questions. He has 1 question. Your one, since it's 1, it's shorter. Your 1 is?
Are you a person of faith?
There you go. And he says it just like that. But we can solidly see that people are, while they maybe were never a part of the faith, a lot of these people still are Christians. 4, people are leaving primarily on the secular left. This is fascinating because, as we said in the beginning, people were dechurching on the secular left, but now dechurching on the secular right is happening at twice the pace of the secular left, almost catching up in the full number of dechurched people. So this has lots of implications not only in the church, but in political elections and other areas too. But we need to know that dechurching is happening almost equally on both sides of the political spectrum. Myth number 5, people aren't willing to come back. You heard Mike talk about 100% of the 2.5 million mainstream dechurched evangelicals. They are willing to come back today. 51% of all dechurched evangelicals indicate they are willing to come back today. We used to think about an invitation to church as a relationship killing kind of conversation. Well, if we can adequately identify, oh, this person falls into one of these groups of dechurching, it's actually, we've seen a relational, you gain relational capital by engaging them where they're already interested and in some ways convicted. Myth number 6, America's peak religiosity was around the time of our founding. We tried to find the most non-controversial way to make that statement. Some people would say we need to return to the founding of our country. Well, do you know what percentage of Americans in 1776 went to church? 17. 49% is not great, but I don't want to go back to 17. And so really I want to be clear, I am very pro-U.S. Constitution. But I feel like it's hard to argue against the fact that it was if not the watershed document into secularism in the Western world. If you compare it with the constitutions of the colonies, take Connecticut, for example. Connecticut talks about Jesus. Our Constitution doesn't. Andrew Wilson has done some great work recently talking about how Ben Franklin got Thomas Jefferson to change the words. He was originally, what we know is we hold these truths to be self-evident. Originally, Thomas Jefferson wanted to say we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And Ben Franklin talked him out of it. So again, I'm very pro-Constitution, but we just have to acknowledge the environment that our country was created in. The high watermark of religiosity in our country was in the 20th century. Different parts depending on the theological stream you're in, but it was the 20th century. 3 insights. First, with a campus ministry history myself, this was very interesting. College students who are involved in both a church and a campus ministry are 3 times more likely to stay in church. Now, for social scientists in the room, there is something called selective bias at play here, because those who are most likely to continue in the faith opt into both of these things, but it doesn't make this untrue. So when you have, and what's interesting, if you take away church or campus ministry, this is not true. And as a pastor, I want to say it doesn't have to be a church and some outside campus ministry, although that's a great thing. Churches that simply engage students when they are making this major life transition. So that comprises both the church and the campus ministry space, but it makes me very thankful for all the campus ministries that are available to walk alongside the church. 2, the overwhelming majority of people who dechurch will do so between the ages of 13 and 30. 3 transitions here for most people: high school, college, establishing your young professional life. We have lots of thoughts on all 3 of those stages. As the father of 2 teenagers, a preteen and an elementary schooler, this 13 to 18 is really in my sights right now. But we pull on that thread elsewhere. But then lastly, dechurching disproportionately impacts those with less education and or members of the lower class. So money is an issue here, and money is tied to education. And if you think about these life transitions, they're impacting people, they're causing dechurching. It actually makes sense, because who do life transitions hit the hardest? When somebody becomes a single parent, however that happens, those with safety, the financial safety nets, are able to walk through it, but many other people have to work longer hours, more unusual hours. So dechurching isn't happening to the people on the higher end of the financial spectrum and the higher educated. It's happening to those who are most susceptible to life circumstance. I have lots of thoughts on this. Let me just conclude that part by saying we need to, as churches and institutions, have an eye on those who are most likely or at highest risk of dechurching. So someone becoming a single parent, getting a divorce, moving, we need to care about them for kingdom reasons. But we need to value education. We need to value education to help people be able to earn more money, because Burge would make the argument that the American church tends to work for those who stay on the American path. So that's essentially go to college, then get married, then have kids, stay married. But when people get off that path and they don't have the financial means, they are at high risk for dechurching. So education for them, education because we see education is not taking evangelicals away from the church, and then education for the next generation of leaders. We strongly believe the next generation of leaders in the church, like my friend Ligon Duncan says often, they don't need less education, they need more. The world around them is changing very fast, and when we look at this data, we're not concerned simply with putting bottoms in pews and money in coffers. These are people with souls, eternal souls. And in all likelihood, in all statistical likelihood, the children of the dechurched will become unchurched. They will not have biblical values. They will not have faith. So the generational opportunity is immense. And we believe some of the fruit is low. So I'm gonna let you finish with some of that fruit.
All right, folks, brass tacks. What can we do about this? And how is this relevant for especially Christian higher ed? Number one, help your students find churches. Have a plan for that, okay? Again, this ain't rocket science, but help them find local churches and incentivize them to do so. Two, have robust and vibrant student ministries on your campus. Partner with, any of the many, excellent ministries that do this, and encourage your local churches to make investments as well in the local church. Here's another thing. Consider having a process for your recent graduates. Help them find healthy local churches in the new communities where they're graduating. They're super easy. I work for the Gospel Coalition. You can go on, tgc.org, and you can go on that church search engine, and you can find in 30 seconds, 6 really great churches. In 2 more minutes, you can scroll those websites, and this kid's a Baptist. Okay, well, here's 3 places. I'd encourage you to at least check out these. Spend 3 weeks at each of these 3 things. Okay, again, this is simple stuff. 4. Mental health is an opportunity, okay? The secular life, it's unlivable, okay? We all know this. It doesn't work. You can't just go down up and down the kind of the aisles of Costco worldview and be like, Nietzsche's, half off, and, expressive individualism's BOGO today. It's just, you cobble those things together, and it's not coherent. It's not going to work. And you can't just live your life digitally or on Apple Vision Pro or whatever. 5th, exercising relational wisdom on the individual level and at the institutional level. So much of all of these things just boil down to, how do you make the people feel who you're around? Whether that's on the individual level, or what does it feel like, what emotions does your institution elicit in the people who are connected to it? And so growing, we have a whole chapter on, relational wisdom, and there's a bunch of principles there. You can read that as chapter 9. I think it's good. I wrote that chapter. 6. No offense, Jim. All right, 6. Teach and show how our gospel is true, good, and beautiful. And not just that, but it leads towards both salvation, human flourishing, and the flourishing of creation itself. Okay? It's not enough for us to just tell a 2-chapter gospel of fall and redemption. We got to remember chapters 1 and 4. Creation, fall, redemption, consummation. How far is the work of the atonement of Jesus Christ going? What's that one Christmas song say? As far as the curse is found. So Jesus' work of redemption is accomplishing, redemption for all of creation. Well, that may not feel important to you, and you're maybe, very incentivized to just think about, well, what does this mean for me in hell and, and being in the kingdom? But for other people, this is a part of the story that could speak very powerfully to them. 7, train your students on this kind of dechurching material. Help them identify the kinds of profiles that we're talking about here, and encourage them to take relational risk. Do you remember when you were a college student? You were so much more willing to take risk than, what you are now as, when you're not, that young and you haven't been hurt, all the different ways. Encourage people to take relational risk. Encourage your students to take relational risk. I don't know how much, if we actually have time. I think we have 4 minutes for open Q&A. 10 minutes, okay. All right, so we got 10 minutes to do that. This is my personal email, michael.graham@thegospelcoalition.org. If you want this presentation, if there's anything that, that me or Jim can do to be helpful or resourceful for you, just shoot me an email. We're here to serve, we're here to help. And, we do have to get back to the airport here in not too long, but I do have, we can stick around till about 2:45 and, connect with any of you. And I'm going to put 15 copies of that book here on this table up here. And so if you'll commit to reading it, it's yours for free. All right.
Questions? So we have microphones up front if anybody wants to stand up and ask a question.
So there's something I'd like to check based on what you were saying. The impression that I would have had just intuitively is that the people who have left were already very weakly attached, right? Like not tithers, not regular attenders. So sort of, it's a bad term, but like the chaff, right? Just sort of people. But it sounds like, based on your research, that's not true of all these people. I just wonder if you could comment on that a little further.
I think the simple answer is that it's complicated. For some people, for the cultural Christian, yeah, simple, complicated. You're welcome. For the cultural Christians and folks like that, yeah, you're talking definite chaff. For the mainstream evangelical folks, well, they actually look like they've actually been discipled.
They may still give.
And they may, and some of these people, we have different perspectives maybe than some. We don't think that online, if somebody goes to church online only, we don't count that person as being churched. Because our perspective is, if you're disconnected to the ordinances that we've been given of the Lord's Supper and baptism, and half of the 59 one another's in the New Testament require physical presence, from our perspective, you're dechurched. But back to your question, Hunter, yeah, for some, it's chaff-like, but when you look at the ex-evangelicals and the mainstream evangelicals, well, both of them seem to have received pretty substantive discipleship. I mean, and most of those two groups answered, they really understand Nicene Creed level Christianity, and many of them do seem to want they want to be back at church. It's just, I don't know, these reasons that honestly don't look very good, they don't look like good reasons, has just gotten them out of the habit.
Hey, I'm Aaron Lumpkin. I'm curious, with the research that you did you expose any trends regionally? I grew up in the Bible Belt. I'm in the Midwest now. How you navigate maybe some of these characteristics across the country?
So, who really got decimated was the Midwest. The Midwest did much worse than what we would have anticipated. The South was about average, the West Coast was less than what we would have expected, and then the Northeast was obviously bad, but we knew it was going to be bad. The Midwest, though, looked very difficult, and I think that point that Jim made about lower income and lower education, I mean, you know, if let's say you're in a Midwestern, you know, in the Rust Belt, and the main place of employment, you know, is now shuttered, and, you know, globalization or whatever, well, what's going to happen to some of the institutions that are in that community? Well, we were very surprised at what we were seeing in the Midwest. It's apart from the major cities, it's not good.
Eric Hoekstra at Dordt University. Great research, thank you. But a lot of it's sociological, like what happened to me before, what happened to me after, where am I? Do you have any research on what happens at church? Like, I grew up in a very liturgical tradition. Like, I felt bad about my sin within 10 minutes of coming to church because we had this thing called confession. I go to a wonderful church that's doing great work in Scottsdale, Arizona, Scottsdale Bible. Like, we sing for a while, and then there's like 40 minutes of teaching, and we go home. Is there any about the dechurching, about like what happens at church?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me start by saying that sociologists divide research like this into three categories: belief, belong, behave. We're doing a belonging study, and we're learning things about belief and behavior. But we do know some things about what's going on in church and how it might be contributing to dechurching. We can go to a few different. Let me say the main thing that we've learned is that churches that are embracing Nicene Creed Christianity and doing so in a loving, humble, winsome way, they're doing better than ones who are not doing those things. We know that. But you also see on this continuum, we have, we call it no walls, medium walls, and high walls. So on the high walls, you might think of a church that really is protecting its people from the sin that's outside the camp and developing higher walls than we would say the Bible really calls for, and it actually limits the ability of those coming out of our church to understand how to engage in the world if they've never really been exposed to the world. That would be one extreme. The other extreme is what's come to be known as Coldplay in a TED Talk, where there's just no walls, there's high anonymity, there's generally a lower ceiling to what that church is going to cover, because their main goal is to get people in that church. And if you're not going to do that through solid doctrine and teaching and appropriate church authority, then you're going to have to do that somewhere else. And these churches have leaned towards entertainment, and what you win them with typically is what you win them to. And while I do believe these churches' heart is to be a wide open front door to the dechurched and the unchurched, I think they don't realize or aren't acknowledging how big the back door is at the same time.
Joseph Backholm, a lot was said about just kind of relationships and friendships, and some like, I just don't have any friends there, and if a friend invited me or something, then I'd be happy to go back, but nobody is doing that. A lot of ink has been spilled recently on the loneliness epidemic, the destruction of social attachments. In the chicken and egg dynamic, is this a result of social isolation, or is this causing social isolation?
Lots of thoughts.
Yes. It's a flywheel of dysfunction. Maybe the first mover, it's difficult to say what the first mover is, but there's like a double helix downward spiral of all of these things. Look, religion is an institution in America. trust in institutions in America, of the 14 that Gallup tracks, 13 of those 14 have been in precipitous decline in U.S. public trust. The only outlier to that is the U.S. military. And I think that speaks to, we live in secularism leads to anxiety, okay? Because it's not a livable situation. You're asking yourself to believe mutually exclusive things and try to hold it together in some kind of cohesive way. And then the ways in which technology that was supposed to bring us together is actually, driving huge wedges between, all different kinds of people in ways that don't need to be
So
there.
is this the fault of the iPhone too?
Sure. I mean, the like button, algorithms, the dopamine incentives to, look, yeah, just in the atomizing of all media. I mean, think about the 1969, the moon landing. I think it was 79% of all Americans saw that live. Will we ever have a cultural moment that 79% of Americans see live again? 9/11 didn't even touch that. So, media and the everything's moving down into the substacking of, everything where, even large mainstream media, I mean, Washington Post is hemorrhaging, huge amounts of cash, LA Times, everything's changing in terms of media, and people are niching down in that, and people's media diets looks increasingly more and more individualistic in its nature. And those things are forming and shaping our people a lot more than the 4 hours that they might have in our local church.
Well, and let me add one quick thing to that. It's interesting to me, if you go back to 2019 Christian Twitter, it was solidly 6 months ahead of mainstream media in terms of what they're talking about. So the church leaders were talking about whatever the hot button issue is. We were talking about it 6 months earlier in Christian Twitter than mainstream media, which tells me we do have an opportunity to lead. And I think the church as a whole failed in 2020 to lead through the tension, the fear, the uncertainty that we had, and we have the hope that the church could lead better the next time something like that happens. Last question.
Hi, I'm Deanna Kaiser. I work here at Southwestern. I'm curious, you talked about education and the role education plays in the people who are going to church and possibly those that are leaving church. And then you also mentioned people needing more education going forward if they're out in ministry. I'm curious if there was anything about your research. I personally have experienced, it seems our churches are not prioritizing education for their church staffs the way they once were. Obviously, I personally, and I'm guessing everyone else in this room thinks that's a really bad idea. But can you speak to that? I mean, what do we do as organizations who obviously believe that education is paramount? How do we deal with that? And then a little piece of it is also, there was just a Wall Street Journal article last month talking about how education in general across the country is becoming less and less of a priority, and people don't see the point of it. And then you have your rise in the trade conversations, so.
There's a lot there. I think there's 3 or 4 questions. And so I'm going to try to hit some of those things. If I miss something, what I want you to do is remind me of the things that the other things I missed. Okay. So one of the pieces I heard is missing continuing ed for practitioners in ministry. Yes?
That's some of it, yeah.
Okay. So I work for this thing called the Gospel Coalition. It's right there in the email or whatever. You should go on that website if you don't know it. But this is one of our, kind of bread and butter. Part of what we exist to do is either be for the people who would never go to seminary, but they want more than what they're getting necessarily in their particular local church. Well, we got something there. And then for the people who are between like the MDiv and the DMin, so let's say you're a pastor, you've been doing it for a decade, and it's like, well, I need to know something about cultural apologetics. Well, we provide resources, that kind of, it's like the expanding spray foam that fits in the, in the cracks between some of these pieces in higher ed. What were some of the other, help me laser in. Yeah.
Piece of the question. So as a pastor, I'll tell you something that is blessing us with our relationship with RTS Orlando. We as a church made the decision that we really want to invest in the next generation of church leaders, men and women. And so we made the decision that we were going to give pulpit time. We were going to give create teaching opportunities for women's ministry in other ways. And we were, especially at the pulpit, now we're in the complementarian space, and we believe that young men who are called to, and their calling is affirmed in terms of their gifting, we want to partner with RTS and give them real positions of opportunity and in some cases authority to be able to exercise those gifts. And the result is not only their development, but they're then the ones teaching this great theology that they're learning in our adult education classes and other atmospheres. And so after just about 5 years of really investing in this and the blessing again of RTS, it is amazing to me to see the number of future church leaders getting formal education and the lay people benefiting from that education in our church. It's really exciting to be able to see, and anecdotally, I had a heart attack last month, and I'm good, but it took me out for a month. Very unexpected, I'm fine, but it was amazing to be able to unexpectedly step out of our church for a month, and everything just seemed seamless. And I'm very thankful it's not just me, the elders and other key stakeholders are embracing the stewardship of theological education in our town, and we are greatly blessed because of it. Does that touch on part of your question?
Yeah, and some of it may just be rhetorical, but it's how people in this room, how do we engage the churches to help them prioritize education? Because we have personnel committees in churches that are looking at hiring people that have no formal education at the level of being on church staff.
Well, I think there are other people in this room who could answer that a lot better than me, but I think it's a great question. And I think we need to be thinking, how do we make education accessible without watering it down? And that's a hard conversation to have at this day and age. And different people have chosen different paths, but that, I think, is the hardest question that educators, that administrators of higher Christian education have to answer. How do we leverage technology to make it more accessible without watering it down? And how do we call our potential students to more when some paths are just easier? That's hard. I'm affirming that. I'm not remotely giving a good solution to it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jim and Mike. Thank you for making the time and effort to be with us and giving us a lot to think about. So these conversations will continue. We have, I think, a presentation at 2:45 that's going to build on this and even give us some opportunities, some hopeful opportunities for what's forthcoming. So let's take 20 minutes, be back in here, ready to go, 2:45. Refreshments are outside.